It's time to get back into Paul's letter to the Galatians. This time we'll read verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1. It sounds like this. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Well, as I've grown up and seen many of my peers become adults, I've learned that parents can spend 18 years training a child in the way he or she should go, as Proverbs 22:6 says, but it only takes one good-looking guy or girl with a different set of values to come along and undo it all. In the same way, a pastor can spend decades teaching his congregation the true gospel, but one persuasive person with one crazy idea can flip the whole church upside down. Jesus, in many places, referred to those who believe in him by using plant-based metaphors. And it's fitting to speak of the church as a plant, because if a plant is left unattended, it will die. Weeds will choke it out, or the sun may scorch it. Every church is like a plant. It must be watched carefully. And so, knowing that churches need constant reminders of the gospel, Paul ends up visiting the towns in Galatia 3 total times in the book of Acts. We've got Acts 13 and 14, the beginning of Acts 16, and Acts 18. Now, the church's tendency to drift had never been more obvious than it was in the Galatian situation. Paul had just visited these cities in Acts 13 and 14, but there were some false teachers who were right on his tracks, following right behind him. So Paul speaks loudly and harshly at times to the Galatians because he has to, just like you would if your friend was wandering towards the edge of a cliff. I'm sure if Paul had addressed this letter to the Americans rather than the Galatians, the language would still be strong. Not just because of the rampant sin and sexual immorality, or the greed and the gossip, although he'd touch on those too, I'm sure. But I think his harshest language for us would be about how there's a church on every corner of every street. And literally, where we are, there's a road called Todd's Lane. It's got so many churches on it, people jokingly call it God's Lane. Or and that intersects with Big Bethel, which Bethel just means the house of God. So we are in the thick of it in terms of churches and church culture here. But we've got a church on every corner of every street, and many of them aren't preaching the gospel week to week. Some of them maybe never. But as we read and study Paul telling it like it is to these Galatians, let's remember who he's addressing. These aren't churches filled with people who had fallen into sin or backslidden from, the faith with doubt or that sort of thing. Here, Paul is rebuking people who think they're better Christians than they once were because of something they did and were requiring others to do. So let's see what he says in verses 6 and 7. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Now, just to be honest with you, with these kinds of accusations, it's a wonder that this letter wasn't torn up by the recipients on the spot, never to be seen again. Yet here we have it in our Bibles today. These are no gentle words. Paul says he is astonished. Well, what is it that has Paul's jaw on the floor? He can't believe that these people had abandoned the gospel and that it happened so fast. Paul says, I was barely out of the church parking lot and down the street before I heard about your sudden wrong way of thinking. It's like you could hardly wait for me to get out the door. I mean, if a church drifts over decades and decades, it's not as much of a surprise. Just compare what most of the major Christian denominations are like now to what they were 100 years ago. It's totally different. But this kind of quick departure from the truth is shocking. So Paul is stunned that these people have so quickly abandoned not just the gospel, but God himself. Did you notice that? Paul doesn't accuse them of going away from the gospel first, but from leaving the Lord. And that's because to deny the gospel is to deny God. Paul was like, listen, let me level with you. It's not your theology or your behavior that's a little off. You've completely abandoned Christ. These people had tossed out grace and threw away their calling in order to turn to a completely different message. But it's not like there is another message of good news that can compete with Jesus. There is no other gospel. There are only fake religious messages used to fool people. In this case, the Galatians had traded gold for brass by giving away a message of God's grace in exchange for human effort. So Paul's mind is blown that some people would try to pay for something that's free. Let's take an example. Imagine your favorite musician or your favorite movie or your major league sports team that you like came to the city near you announcing free shows, free games, free showings of the movie, and you stood outside the door at the box office trying to pay to get in and convincing everyone else that they needed to pay. That's ridiculous. What you're actually doing is hindering people from getting into the free show by telling them they need to pay something. When it comes to the gospel, there is no price for you to pay, and there is no other show in town. It's all about God's grace, and there is only one gospel. Now, just to let you know, there are some people out there in the world and in the church that if they heard what I'm telling you, simply trying to explain what Paul says in Galatians, they would say, oh, this guy teaches cheap grace. That just any old person can have the grace of God, and that anyone can be saved and all that sort of thing. It's cheap grace. You have to, the way they paint grace is you basically have to earn it. But that's absurd. Cheap grace is way too expensive. God's grace is free because it's already been paid for by Jesus Christ. And I personally am not about to insult the Son of God by suggesting that he and I go halvesies on my salvation. There are, however, many people in Christianity today and in the church and in the world with some other religions who wish to change this up. They want to change or twist the message by adding to it. And when Paul says these people are distorting the gospel of Christ, he doesn't just mean the good news about Jesus Christ, but the good news given by Jesus Christ as the author. Remember in Hebrews it says, he is the author and finisher of our faith. It's not that people in Galatia were just tampering with a message or story about Jesus. They were screwing up the story given, written, and lived out by Jesus. So we need to take Paul's advice and watch out for these people. I like the way he puts it in Philippians 3, verse 2. Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. Talking about those who require circumcision in order to be accepted by God. And that's the same problem that the Galatian churches are facing. Look out for anyone who makes the gospel about what you can do for God rather than what he's already done for you. Watch out for those who tell you to be cut for Jesus instead of declaring Jesus was cut and bled for you. And it doesn't matter who tells you this different gospel either. Listen to this in verses 8 and 9. Even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we've said before, now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. Paul says, even if we, meaning himself, his fellow apostles and co-workers, even if we contradict the gospel, may we be cursed. Notice how he puts himself under examination before anyone else. If a few months down the road I come to you with a changed mind and a different message, don't believe me, Paul says. But he also includes that a false gospel could come from a heavenly angel. Now, obviously, we know demons or fallen angels of darkness are out there spreading falsehood, and Paul prophesied this in 1 Timothy 4:1, where it says, now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. But here, Paul says that an angel from heaven could even be wrong. I would suggest to you, though, if you think an angel has given you a message, but it contradicts the gospel, chances are you've been tricked and it was a deceiver in disguise all along. In 2 Corinthians 11:14, Paul says, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Now, there's a good chance that Paul brings up angels because people were claiming to have heard their version of the gospel directly from an angel in an attempt to give themselves more weight and credibility. After all, what gets your attention better? Hey, I just read this letter from Paul. Well, let's all discuss it. Or, listen, this morning an angel stood in my bedroom and told me. Yeah, I think the second introduction gets your attention a little bit more, and you're more curious at least about what someone's going to follow that up with than, hey, I read this letter. By the way, Mormonism began when one kooky guy claimed that an angel visited him. If someone thinks, though, that they've heard a different gospel from an angel, Paul says, that's all right. My gospel came directly from Jesus Christ and God the Father, and we'll see that in verse 11 when we get there. The point is, if anyone, your church, your beloved pastor, an apostle, your sweet parents, your best friend, the Pope, your therapist, your spouse, or your favorite influential Christian tells you a different gospel, quickly show them the door. Let them be accursed. Anathema is the Greek word there, Paul says. And if someone's spreading a different gospel, this is what it means. They can go to hell. Accursed, anathema. This moment of the letter is similar to how Jesus rebuked the Pharisees in Matthew 23. Verse 15 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte," that's a convert, "and when he becomes a convert, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Later in verse 33 of that chapter, he says, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell?" See, the God who became a curse on the cross for you, as chapter 3 will tell us, will curse you if you twist the good news about him. And just so we're clear, what was the message that these Galatians heard? We know that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says the gospel is that Jesus died for your sins, was buried, and rose on the third day. But what specifically did these people in Galatia hear from Paul? Because there are many ways to phrase that good news. Well, here's how it goes. We actually have a record of it in the book of Acts, chapter 13. Remember, this is his first visit to this region. Verse 38 says, "Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you, and by him everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses." And in verse 42, I love this. It says, "As they went out, the people begged that these things might be told them the next Sabbath." The people in this city, Antioch of Pisidia, part of the Galatian region, heard about Jesus Christ, the one who could free them from all the things that the law could not. That's what they heard, and they were so amazed that they begged Paul to come back the next week and say the same words again. I love that he goes and preaches on the freedom in Christ, because that will be a huge topic in the letter to the Galatians. Freedom. Chapter 2 and really chapter 5 is where we'll get into that. But since the time that they had heard this preaching, many of the Galatians had embraced another gospel, a message that didn't end with a period, as it's been said, but with a comma. It was no longer, "Jesus purchased your freedom," but it had become, "If you're going to be free, here's a checklist to complete." And that's where the deadly issue comes into play. Because yes, while we Christians can disagree about a lot, we cannot allow anyone to try to tack on requirements to the gospel. That's when our gloves ought to come off. The true Christian faith, the church, is not about laying burdens on people. I hope you don't listen to my lessons here through the Bible as a way of looking for a new routine of righteousness for you to complete. I'm not trying to add onto your plate. I think you've got enough on there. In fact, the ones who add burdens, those aren't Christians, according to Jesus. That's what the Pharisees did. He said, "Woe to you, lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." Instead, as Paul will say towards the end of this letter, the goal of Christian fellowship, the church, is to help carry another's burdens. Galatians 6, verse 2. Let's look at verse 10 and wrap up. "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Now, believe it or not, there were several people who did not appreciate Paul's message of God's liberating grace. They likely accused him of dialing down the less marketable Old Covenant standards in order to recruit more people and accumulate a large following. I can hear them now saying, he wants to be popular, so he preached a more convenient way of salvation rather than the strictness of the law. But Paul's attention is not to seek attention. He fires back with this letter saying, oh, you think I'm softening up the word? Well, how soft has my letter been to you so far? It's obvious that Paul doesn't preach a message that people naturally like. But that's okay. He didn't sign up for the entertainment industry. He wrote on behalf of God, not man. And so his ministry was more aimed at pleasing God and not man. Paul could have easily compromised and said, you know what, guys? I know that people love to have something to do. They love to have some role to play. And circumcision is as good a work as any. So yeah, everybody get circumcised and get yourself right with God. But Paul is not after the applause of the crowds. He's a servant of Christ and no longer obligated to please man. And I like in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul will talk about serving, who you're serving. And basically it says, you were bought with a price, reference to Jesus died for you. So don't become the slaves of men. You don't have to serve men because you were bought by God. You're accepted by God. You don't have to be accepted by men and be enslaved to the idea of people pleasing. Living to please man is foolish and a waste of time, but I want you to realize also that living to please God is impossible. Paul later says in chapter 3, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. And that's where the true gospel comes into play. Because as a person in Christ by faith, even though you are a sinner, you have not kept God's law perfectly, and you will not, you already have God's approval. And it's not based on whether you've been circumcised or not. It's totally based on God's grace and the true gospel, of which there is one, and Paul is the preacher. We will read more of Galatians in our next session.